I've got book hangover. G'day to all you lovely people and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about this chonker, Toll the Hounds, Book 8 in Malazan the Book of the Fallen series by Steven Erikson. This book is massive. It's the longest one I've read so far in the series. I think it has 1,269 pages. Ridiculous. No, I don't mean that. The book is ridiculous. The size is. When you look at it, it's like 3 books. 3 or 4 normal books. What is normal anyway? Nevertheless, I guess the question is, was it worth it? Yes. Fair warning. This book encompasses so much, there is no way I'm going to be able to do full justice to it. So I'm going to concentrate only on those things which had an impact on me, which left me pondering. Before I start the review, I just wanted to mention that I noticed I read this book much faster than the previous books in the series. And I put that down to 2 reasons. One is I've become much more familiar with Steven Erikson's writing style. So it read faster for me. And the second reason is that I'm now very familiar with this world. I know most of the characters. I know roughly how the world operates. So I wasn't trying to work things out as I read. And one of my favourite things about the book is that we are back in Darajistan. And it felt so familiar and nostalgic, like having an old blanket, because we are going back to the beginning, to Gardens of the Moon, where we met some of these characters. We also see characters from Memories of Ice, and I just loved catching up with all of these characters and seeing what they were up to, what was going on, etc. But every alternate chapter, and I think that's correct, we see Black Coral, where Anamanda Rake and his Tist and I have settled. And that was a fascinating glimpse into a world we haven't explored before. We have known very little about Anamanda, and now we actually get to see who he is, though only through really other people's perspectives. I don't think we actually saw a perspective of his. So each chapter, it was either Darajistan or Black Coral, together with several groups, several characters, travelling to either one or the other, including Kasa and Samadev. We also see Nimanda and Clip heading obviously to Black Coral, or you assume that's where they're heading. And we also see some surprises, certain characters who are not named immediately, you're not sure who they are. One was the Traveller. It took me a while sometimes to recall some of the characters that we saw, because it has been quite a while and a lot has happened since I met some of them. Like I said, we're going back to books 1 and book 3, and this is book 8. So sometimes it was like I have to look up who this is because I don't recall them. I mean, I recognize the name, but I don't recall their role in the book. So let's start with Darajistan, as I think that is the first chapter. I loved being back in Darajistan. I think it is my favourite city in all of the books so far. Not that we've seen a lot of cities, but I just love the feel of it. There is this real cosmopolitan feel to the city, even though some of the politics are getting murkier and murkier. But many of the characters that we saw are familiar faces like Krupe. And I think it's in the prologue that Krupe is retelling this story to us, retelling what is occurring in Daregistan. And I loved how Erikson wrote him, how he described what was happening in Daregistan. I loved how poetical at times his writing was, how full of empathy and love and understanding Krupe is for the citizens of Daregistan and all their foibles, all their flaws. He always seems so accepting of people's flaws, never judgmental. I loved that. But this book has a lot of perspectives. I think it is over 100, I was told. I think it's only second to Reaper's Gale, which had a few more, but still, it became difficult at times to keep track of all the perspectives because that's a lot. Some I think you will like more than others, like anything, right? Some storylines really appeal to me, others not so much. I was extremely pleased to see Toll the Hounds back. If people don't recall him, he was imprisoned with Casa all along and they became friends. And in fact, he saved Casa. I always liked this character and I was really happy to see him again and learn more about his story and his life in Daregistan. We also met his wife and they have a wonderful relationship, a really deep connection and understanding of each other, tolerance of each other. But Torvald is a bit of a scoundrel, I guess. Well, right at the beginning, when he first returns to Daregistan and he's being accused of owing all this money to this merchant crook, he actually goes to steal from the merchant and instead has sex with his wife before he goes back and meets his own wife. So I guess, yeah, he is a bit of a scoundrel, but he appeals to me anyway because he is a decent guy. What he did for Casa was very compassionate, and that is one of his traits. He also happens to be the cousin of Relic Nom. And then, of course, Relic Nom is released from the Azath house together with the head of the assassins, who also happens to be a mage. The Assassins Guild, of course, has been taken over by somebody else while they were in the Azath house. And they happen to have a hit on bridge burners, because there are a few bridge burners living in Daregistan. I must admit, when I saw the bridge burners, I was so happy. I have missed them and loved them from the very beginning, and it just felt so nostalgic for me to see them, to see their interactions. The only thing I found really heartbreaking was Duca. He seemed so lost after what happened to the Chain of Dogs and Coltane, and I found that quite sad, actually. There are a lot of convergences, even minor ones, between characters we've met in previous books who now are brought together and are interacting, which I really enjoyed, actually, because some of these characters are favourites. I love Mappo, though again we didn't spend as much time with him as I would have liked, but his storyline was really interesting. I've never really liked the guild all that much, the Trigale Guild. I can't remember how to pronounce it, but Gruntle's and Mappo's adventures with the guild were one of my favourite parts of the book. I was surprised at just how interesting it became, and hilarious at times, I can't deny it. And Gruntle. He's always been one of my favourites from Memories of Ice. I was really pleased to see him and Stony, though it was hard reading about how Stony had reacted to her rape and bearing a child from that rape. Harlow, I think, was 5 years old, and I fell in love with this little boy. He was just adorable, and honestly, I was just gutted when he was taken to the mines and made a slave, basically. He was just 5 years old, for heaven's sake. But this book illustrated for me the broad range, variety in personalities, in human nature, where you go from one end of the spectrum with just selfish, evil, callous people to the selfless, to the compassionate. And I think that's true to life. That is how society is made up. We are all different in many ways. We may share some common traits, but we do have that spectrum. And some of the characters, of course, elicited more sympathy in me than others. I do feel, however, that I also got to understand some characters who we haven't spent a lot of time with previously. But for me, this book really felt like a throwback, a nostalgic throwback to the early books, to Gardens of the Moon. We even saw Chalice again, and Crocus, or Cutter. Yeah, okay, I will confess that I am so bored with Crocus. I am just not interested in this character. Now, I can understand why some people like him. I don't. I was just so tired of this character. I also didn't like how he behaved in certain scenes. The way he ignored Solara and Barathol was quite callous, actually. And then when he starts an affair with Chalice, who he liked when he was younger, when we first met him, it was only after sex that he actually remembered Solara and felt guilty. Yeah, to me that just displayed real selfishness. And the fact that he is still in love with Apsala doesn't absolve him of responsibility to treat others well. I really disliked this character in the end, and I just didn't care what he did. Now, Chalice, on the other hand, had a much more interesting story. She married that young noble Isagorlan who we had met in Gardens of the Moon. She was now very unhappy in her marriage because her husband is a cold fish who only cares about power and may even be gay. I'm not sure, but that is kind of a feeling I got as I was reading the book, and clearly cared nothing for Chalice. So she was a very unhappy housewife, I guess. Nevertheless, I found her a very unsympathetic character for me. But as I said, this is what Toll the Hounds was, a slice of life of different characters living in this great city. However, Crocus was, or Cutter I should say, was in one of my favourite scenes in the book, near the end, in his confrontation with Gorlas. I've only dealt so far with Darugistan. I think I've covered most of the main players. There is, of course, also Murillo. Oh, I forgot Murillo. I can't forget Murillo. He was always one of my favourites from Gardens of the Moon and Memories of Ice. I really liked his character. He's a bit of a Don Juan, a bit of a Casanova, I guess, but he had heart, real heart. Relic Nom, for example, the assassin, I always found him very cold, very distant, most likely because he is an assassin. His cousin Torvald is delightful. I loved reading about him. And Murillo, realizing he's getting older like all of us, realizing he may not be quite the same suave young lover that he used to be, who almost gets killed with his pants down. Yeah, there were some very, very funny scenes throughout this book, but there are also some absolutely tragic ones, heartbreaking ones. Okay, I can't remember where I was up to because I was interrupted by the phone. Okay, I was talking about Daradjistan and all the characters that we meet there. New ones, old ones. I should also mention Solara and Barathol. Barathol, I just love Barathol. He is one of my favourites anyway. Wanting to set up a blacksmith business and being stymied by the guild, whose rules seem utterly ridiculous. Typical bureaucratic red tape. This, of course, reflects our own society and how we can be hamstrung by bureaucratic red tape. But there's also the political machinations of Gorlas and his cronies. Young blood trying to jockey for position on the council to have more power, trying to get rid of the old guard in favour of the new guard. So many of the things that were occurring in Daradjistan mirror our own society in many ways, which allowed Erikson to put forth his views, his philosophy regarding human nature, regarding history, regarding politics, etc. But I'll get to that in a moment. Barathol and what he did to the guild's representatives, I absolutely loved. I thought that was just, very admirable. Then, of course, there is Solara, who has been rejected by Crocus, no surprise there, who is trying to make her own way in Daradjistan. Iskrul Past, I guess I should talk about Iskrul Past. Yeah, he was actually a little annoying to me in this book. I did not enjoy his character all that much. He was funny at times, but he irritated me more often than not. Nevertheless, it was occasionally funny, but overall I just wasn't interested in Iskrul. No, I really wasn't. And I was trying to figure out actually just what his role was in Daradjistan, why he was there. As I said before, Daradjistan is definitely my favourite city in these books. I doubt that there will be another that I love as much as this one. And that I put down a lot to the actual characters that inhabit it, because I love Krupe. He has definitely grown on me more and more and more throughout these books. And I always thought he was similar to Iskrul, but he's so much more than that. And I'm still uncertain what he is. He's obviously extremely knowledgeable. He seems also powerful. So is he a god? Is he an elder god? Is he something else entirely? Yeah, a lot of speculation as to who he is and what he is. But he was kind of the glue that held so many things together. And perhaps that's partly because he was narrating this story, narrating the lives of all these characters. But I love how compassionate he was when describing even some terrible characters like that serial killer who didn't have hands. I can't remember all these names, unfortunately. Well, he was simply a killer, clearly. But his story also was connected to the sergeant, I think the guard, who was hunting him, trying to find who this killer was. And I'll come back to the guard when I talk about the end. Okay, I think I've covered most of the character stories that I wanted to mention from Daradjistan. Let's move on to Black Coral. I loved seeing the Tist Andi up close, getting to understand them better. And Spin. Spin was one of my favourite characters in Black Coral. He seemed also much more compassionate, hadn't quite cut off all emotion like many of the Tist Andi seem to, though I don't think that's fully accurate. I think he was just more in touch with his feelings, and yet I believe he was also an assassin. I could be wrong there, but that was the impression I got, that he was the one who did the dirty jobs for Anamanda. Of course, it was also the High Priestess. Yeah, what a surprise that sex was part of their religion, but it's always been part of pagan religions, so that's not unexpected. But Spin's friendship with Seadomin, I really loved that. This person who I think, and I could be wrong here, was one of the compassionate souls who helped Tok the Younger when he was imprisoned by the Panian Domin. I guess it's not surprising that some of these characters felt some remorse, or a lot of remorse or regrets regarding their actions, like Seadomin felt for his involvement in the cult. And I just love these pairings, these friendships that develop between characters who you wouldn't expect. Nobody does it better than Erikson, if you ask me. And it was a genuine and deep friendship. I also loved learning so much more about the Tist Andi. They have been so mysterious up to now. We've only known a little about their society. We've had hints of what led to the split between the Tist Andi and the brothers in particular, but that's all. Whereas now we learned why Mother Dark turned against her children. We learned how lost they feel since she turned her back on them. And I've learned the significance of Karkanas, because I know that's a trilogy that Steven Erikson has started. I don't think it's finished yet. Learning about their history truly helped me understand the Tist Andi better. It helped put them in perspective for me, understand their motivations. Though Anamanda is, of course, still a bit of a mystery. And that was very deliberate on Steven Erikson's part. We also have that young priestess of, what is it, the God of Redemption? Isn't that Ikovian's title? I think that's right. Part of me was glad to see him, part of me was not. But if nothing else, this book made clear how gods are created in this world, that it is by worship that they can become an ascendant or a god. If anyone deserves it, I guess you could say he did, but on the other hand, I also think he deserved to rest. What he did for the Talanin Mass was one of the most compassionate gestures throughout these series. So it's no surprise that he is now being worshipped as well. I really did enjoy that storyline, but it also felt very bleak at times. The worst of human nature, just like in Darajistan. We see the best with Ikovian, and then we see the worst with these former soldiers who are raping and killing all these people. And of course, then there is that blood of the dying god. And would you believe, I cannot remember what it's called. It's only referred to 1,000,000 times in the book, but yeah, it's just gone out of my memory. Now that was an interesting storyline, that this dying god's blood was infecting people, making them, fanatics in many ways, and yet destroying themselves in the process as well. Of course, that storyline was connected to Namanda, the young Tist Andi, who are coming in search of Anamanda, the ones with Clip. And I didn't enjoy that storyline, I have to confess. One of the criticisms I have of the book is the reveal as to who this dying god was. I thought, this is such an insignificant character. From my understanding, he was the companion of Nightchills, whom I think killed Tattersail in Gardens of the Moon. We've never seen him again. We hardly know anything about him. I actually thought the dying god might be the cripple god, but clearly not. Regardless, I think I would have preferred if it was the cripple god to this insignificant character. To me, it really was a storyline I could have done without. I have to admit, I much preferred the chapters on Darajistan than the ones in Black Coral. There was just this sense of real gloom and bleakness, sadness. Whenever I read about Black Coral, there were a few highlights, I can't deny it, but overall I found it quite depressing. Enda Silan, that elderly wizard, whilst I really did love his recollections of Karkanis and the history of the Tist Andi, I think his stories sometimes went a little too long, but you could argue that applied to many of the stories in this book, or many of the characters' storylines, I should say. My favourite was definitely the interactions the characters had with Anamanda and Spin. I love Spinnock. He was definitely my favourite from Black Coral. Him and Seadomin. I really enjoyed their storylines. Now, of course, there are also characters on their way to either Black Coral or Darajistan. Let's start with Namanda and the other young Tist Andi and Clip, whose character arc kind of seemed to just peter out. He seems such a significant character in Reaper's Gale, I think it was, but in this one, he played a much smaller role. He did not seem all that important, and I guess he really wasn't in the end. It was more Namanda coming into his own authority as a leader, growing as a character into a leader, into somebody that initially we think is not leader material, and yet as time progressed, as events occurred, you see that he has much more gravitas than we've given him credit for, or that the author's given him credit for. I always thought he was very young and uncertain and unsure about what to do, and he never felt that he deserved to be a leader. And yet I saw him growing throughout this book, and his was definitely a character arc I enjoyed, as well as the others, though not all of the characters I liked equally in his party. Some of them were just, I could do without. Nevertheless, it showed that he brought them together. And even though Clip supposedly was leading them, in the end it was Namanda that everyone turned to, and Namanda who helped save Clip. I also liked that Mother Dark was also there with them, that she was guiding them as well. That was really cool. It's the next day. I wanted to talk about Callor. I've never liked Callor, but I don't think we were meant to. When we first read about him, and I think it was in a prologue in one of the earlier books, he was destroying civilizations because he didn't get what he wanted. He was all about power. And he certainly wasn't likable in Memories of Ice, but this time we actually got to see his perspective. And whilst I feel I understand him so much better than I have previously, I still despise him because he is such a selfish individual. Very cynical, but also always out for his benefit, no one else's. The only sign of humanity or something likable about him was his feelings for Anamanda and the Tist Andai. He clearly cared about them, but he cared about nothing else, just himself. And you have to wonder how much he cares about them and how much he cares about what they can do for him, especially Anamanda. But I'm glad he didn't get the sword. I'm really glad he didn't. Then, of course, there was Draconis's two daughters, Spite and Envy, who just seemed like teenagers having a brawl over who was prettier, who was smarter. Oh, I guess it shows you that even gods or ascendants are just as petty as human beings are. They were funny, but we didn't see a lot of them anyway. And then, of course, there is Kasa. I love Kasa. I do not agree with his intention of wiping civilization. That, to me, I don't understand fully. I know he believes that humanity is flawed, that all the trappings of civilization just bring out the worst in humanity. Not necessarily a wrong view, but I don't think his solution is the one. But I didn't expect him and Dassam Alta to form such a close friendship. And I love Dassam Alta. I had read about him in Night of Knives, so I feel I know a little bit about him, and I did guess that Traveller was Dassam Alta, but even so, he seemed so much more reasonable than anybody else of these powerful beings. And he's clearly a lot more than just a human. And I know it wasn't mentioned in Toll the Hounds, but I do recall that he owed a debt to Hood for, I think, taking his family or his children, and his intention was to kill Hood. I did know that. So I could see why he was so single-minded. But when his prey escaped him at the end, it was clear that he was left floundering because he felt he had no other purpose in life. And I guess that just illustrates how vengeance doesn't heal any wounds. It doesn't fill any need in you. All it does is help you vent your fury, your anger, your hurt, but still leaves you empty in the end. You still need more than vengeance. They were some of my favourite parts though, reading about Dassam and Kasa and Samadev, who's clearly something a bit more. There was, I think, something said to the effect that she is a priestess of the goddess Burn. I found that really interesting, actually. And this bear, it seemed like it was trying to protect her. This bear, which was a god, but is no longer powerful because he has no worshippers. This is the 4th time I'm recording part of this video, so I have to apologize to all of you if it seems a bit disjointed, but it's been a hell of a week and I have simply not been able to sit down and record the whole thing in one go. Alright, so let's continue where I left off. Murillo's death. Huh. He was one of my favourite characters because he was warm and compassionate and so kind that I was just gutted when he was killed by Gorlas. I hated Gorlas so much. I don't think you were meant to like him. But what I really despise about this character, Gorlas, is that he paid lip service to the concept of honour, to the rules and etiquette regarding dueling, and yet when it didn't serve his purpose, he just ignored those rules. He is the worst kind of hypocrite. Characters like this, people like this, are the worst kind. They claim to be bound by certain conventions or rules, but only when it suits them. So I was really upset that he killed Murillo, because not only was Murillo already weakened when they started the duel, when he tried to invoke that rule about calling an end to the duel, Gorlas continued. He was such a ruthless, despicable character, and I didn't see any redeeming quality in this character. But worse than Murillo's death was it left me wondering, is Harlow ever going to be rescued? Or is he trapped forever as a slave in these mines? So I was doubly upset at his death and seeing all his friends, Murillo's friends, grieving for him. I felt very similarly. That's the thing with these books, and I think that's the kind of reader I am. Once I become attached to characters, I become very emotional when things happen to them. And that, to me, illustrates how much I'm loving the books. Yeah. But Gorlas did get his comeuppance. Because now I have to talk about Crocus, right? Or Cutter. The only scene I liked him in throughout this entire book was when he confronted Gorlas. And I think he understood his opponent very well. He understood that Gorlas had no honour, so why should he? However, Gorlas also opened the door when he said no rules applied. And I loved, oh wow, did I love that Crocus just killed him. Yet there was no dueling, there was no fight. He just threw his knives and killed him, just like that. It was executed so well, that scene, that despite it being Crocus who was in it, I thought it was perfection. It was just done so well, written so well. It still doesn't make me like Crocus, I have to admit. He is still my least favourite character, I think, throughout these books. I guess I should also talk about Chalice. Yeah. I really disliked her character. And I've had debates with some people on the Discord as to her personality and her situation. I think she had a lot more agency than other characters. I think that she chose to stay in this relationship because she liked her comfortable life and her position in society. And when she tried to get Crocus to agree to go and kill her husband, that seemed to me all that she wanted out of that relationship from the beginning, that was her aim. And in the end, she committed suicide. But perhaps it was because of what she thought she had done to Crocus, causing him to kill her husband because of her. And that she didn't feel she was worthy of that. I don't know. I didn't find her death sad though. I just thought she was a character I could have done without in this book. I guess now I should talk about the end, right? And the convergence of all these characters or storylines. I'll start first with Namanda and the Kalik, because now I remember what it's called, and Malazan or the Dying God. Not my favourite storyline, I have to admit. I think it just illustrates that when people despair, when they don't think there is any hope, they will seize on anything. And when the finale regarding that storyline played out, I found it a little anticlimactic for me. Let's be honest, I was much more interested in Daregistan and what was happening there than what was happening in Black Coral. So let's talk about Daregistan. Yeah. Let's start first with Hood manifesting in this world through the sacrifice of that serial killer by his own wife. Wow, yeah. You forget sometimes that he's an actual God, that people do pray to him. You forget that being a God doesn't necessarily mean he is omnipotent or perfect, that he is as flawed as humanity. And I think that's what Toll the Hounds illustrated for me, that gods aren't perfect, that they are beings, yes, and they have great powers based on whether they are worshipped or not, but they are also flawed, aren't they? Hood's walk was so well written. I loved it. Just seeing the impact he was having on the people in Daregistan. It was one of my favourite scenes throughout this book. And yet I think my absolute favourite was what he did with the guard who he saved. It also showed me that he wasn't just this cold, distant being. He was also capable of compassion, of recognising honour, integrity in others. I mean, we have seen glimpses of that in the past, like when he escorted Beak himself in Reaper's Gale. But I loved that he saved the guard. It made me like him so much more. I still don't know what agreement he reached with Quick Ben. I have to wonder if it was to broker this deal with Anamanda. But I did not expect Anamanda to just lop off his head. That left me utterly stunned. I thought they were going to have a conversation as they were converging with each other, and yet Hood didn't even get to finish before his head was gone. I thought, what? This is going to change everything. And if that wasn't enough, if it wasn't that Hood is killed, is dead, and trapped in Dragnapur, and Amanda also dies. Decimalta kills Anamanda. You wonder if he actually did kill him, or if Anamanda did that deliberately so that he could also be trapped in the sword. I did not expect Hood's death, let alone Anamanda. And I can see why a lot of people love Anamanda Rake, because he was always a very mysterious figure whose motivations were not quite clear, though we did get a better understanding of him in this book. But I think what I came away with at the end was that Anamanda was very honourable and selfless, who was willing to sacrifice himself for a greater good, to release Mother Dark, to hold back the chaos that was encroaching on the wagon and the prisoners. I mean, these are world-changing events, not just life-changing. The whole landscape of this world is going to be affected by what happened, because there's no Hood anymore. So where do the dead go? And Amanda is in the sword, or is he in the sword? Because at the very end, Caladan Brood breaks the sword, and we're given to believe that all the prisoners are going to escape. Does that mean Anamanda is going to escape? Does that mean Hood is going to escape? What about all the undead that went with Hood to the sword? I did not guess that the leader of the undead was Whiskey Jack. Okay, I must admit I got a little teary when I saw that, because I have missed Whiskey Jack, and he was also one of my favourite characters from the early books. But that was just so cool. And yet, what does it mean that some of them died? Can they die if they're undead? What does it mean? Oh, there's still always so many questions after these books. But that whole last 300 pages of the book were just brilliant. Brilliant. I think some of my favourite scenes throughout this series. And of course, then there were the hounds. I forgot to mention the hounds. I didn't understand why the hounds were there. But then, of course, I should have guessed Shadow Throne was after Dragnapur. They were all after Dragnapur. How they knew that this was going to happen, I'm assuming that is because they are ascendants or gods. But even so, what about these white wolves? I'm uncertain exactly what they are, who they represent, what their role is in this world, if any. Having so many wonderful characters that I learned to love throughout this book, if I haven't loved them earlier, such as Kasa and Samadev and Dasam Alta and Anamanda and Barathol. I always get his name wrong. I just loved seeing them all together for this convergence. I just love seeing them in Darajistan, fighting, I would say, for the good of all, trying to protect the people of this town, of this city. Shadow Throne, he does infuriate me because he always has an agenda. But I do like that it seems Iskral Past was after the sword for himself, not necessarily for Shadow Throne. And his confrontation with Krupe was hysterical. The way Erikson described him trying to ride this mule faster than it really was going, the way Krupe was able to hold him off, it was, one of my favourite scenes as well. That and Hood's Walk, definitely my favourite scenes. Now, before I summarise, I wanted to also share what I didn't like about the book, because I do have some criticisms, and what I really loved about the book. So let's start with criticisms. I really found the revelation that Belladon was a dying god very unsatisfying. Yeah, I didn't like this revelation. I think we should have been given more hints, perhaps earlier, to guess it. Perhaps I would have enjoyed it more if it had been a different character. We were also given to believe that his personality had merged into Silver Fox, because we were told there were several personalities there. If he's not there, then who are these other personalities in Silver Fox? And the calyx, I guess, perhaps that is a metaphor for fanaticism. But that was one of my least favourite things about this book. And another criticism I have is that it was too long, that there was too much philosophizing or commentary in this book about human nature, about conflicts, about lust, about power, about greed. And some of these concepts he's already covered in previous books. I think less would have been more. I think we were overwhelmed with too many concepts and ideas that we just didn't have time to really consider them at length before we presented with a new one. However, I do have a proviso. I'm 61. I have very similar views to Steven Erikson. As I was reading about these philosophies, I kept thinking, yes, 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 I agree, I agree, I agree, I agree. Because these are also things that I have thought about throughout my life. So for me, it was simply affirmation of my own views about all of these issues. Perhaps if I was younger, some of the ideas that he presented would have had more of an impact on me. Another criticism I might have, and this one I think will depend on each person, I felt that there were too many themes that Erikson raised in this book. But I did like these themes of futility, lust for power, that power is nebulous, that it is fleeting, selflessness, sacrifice, and always hope, always. As for the things I loved or adored about this book, this nostalgic feeling of being back at the beginning, of seeing characters from the very first book, of being back in Daregistan. I love seeing how these characters have developed, changed over the years. I love seeing other characters that are favourites from other books also appearing in this, such as Gruntle and Stony. I also love seeing Barathol also in Daregistan, and Solira and Duca. He was hard to read about because he seems such a shadow of his former self, but I guess that would be realistic too. I loved learning about the history of the Tist Andine. I loved also seeing the perspective of some of the Tist Andine. I loved also seeing Ickovian. Yeah, though we didn't really get to see a lot of him, but just learning how a god comes into being in this world. That's what Ickovian was for me in this book. I love seeing how flawed humanity is, and yet it's not always bleak. There's always a sense of underlying hope throughout this book, that there is good in humanity as well, and even in gods or ascendants. And of course I loved Hood's Walk and Krupe's and Iskarul's battle. Seems funny to call it that because it really wasn't. But anyway, that was, I think, much needed light relief after the very dark events that were occurring. Another thing I loved was that Harlow didn't die. I don't think I could have coped if he was killed. He was, I guess, a symbol of the best in humanity. Always such a sweet boy, intelligent and kind, just like the one who took him under his wing. I actually felt quite sad when that boy was killed at the end. I did not feel sad about the other one who tried to kill Harlow, but that's the two sides of human nature, right? Two sides of one coin. We have the good and we have the bad, but there also is in the middle. I loved that Torval Nom was back. I loved him in House of Chains and I wanted to see him again, and I got to spend a lot of time with him. He was a favourite character of mine, and his storyline and his character was also one of my favourites. Flawed, very flawed, and yet human. and yet kind. But I would not call this book bleak, too dark and depressing. I think it is a true glimpse into human nature, into life. All right, I think that's all I've got to say for now, so let's wrap up. In summary, I really loved Toll the Hounds. I loved the writing. It had such beautiful prose. I love so many of the philosophies, opinions, commentary that Erikson had to make regarding human nature, regarding history, regarding conflict. However, I also feel that the book was overly long. But the end. Yeah, the finale, the convergence at the end. The last 300 pages were phenomenal. This finale is obviously going to impact this world so much more than any other finale we have read so far. There were so many things I adored about this book, but I do have a few criticisms. Whilst in some ways the book felt a little bleak at times, there was a sense of futility. There was always an underlying hope that things could be better, that there are good people in this world, even good gods or ascendants. Not everyone is out for their own benefit. That's the message I took away at the end, that hope does exist, and without it, there's not much left, actually. Whilst I'm not going to score this book, I would call it excellent. Like all of them. I'm becoming very predictable, aren't I? But you can see how much of a fan I am of this series. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. Now, of course, I want to hear what you think of Toll the Hounds. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What do you like about the book? What do you dislike about the book? You know, I always want to hear from you because I love discussing these books with you. And you can let me know down in the comments. Thank you all very much for watching. I truly do appreciate it. If you like this video, then you know what to do, right? You can like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I also have a Patreon account if you wish to support me in that way. I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Sword. I can never remember these names, god damn it.